Memorial Day. My wife doesn't volunteer 3 days.
No. It is
Missoula.
4 minutes.
Who's coming?
Well, Larry Hicks is the reason we have the Savory Creek in-stream flow.
Lopsided. I thought I'd go on this.
But we can go around with introductions and all
Yeah.
that.
Whatever, you're the chair.
Everything for
We're going to call this meeting to order. I think we're about 1 minute early. So we'll go with audience introduction and we'll start over there and go around and
My name is Andrew Coleman. I'm with the Wyoming Attorney General's Office, and I'm here to represent the commission.
Dan Larson, House Representative from Powell.
Jordan Little, Wyoming Water Development Commission, representing Water Division 2.
Rod Wagner, Wyoming Water Development Commissioner, District 1.
Kellen Lancaster, Water Development Commission, District 4 from Afton.
Larry Suker, Water Development Commissioner, District 2.
Gerald Geist, District 3. That takes in the Bighorn Basin and Fremont County.
I'm Mike Purcell. I'm the at-large member of the Water Development Commission.
Evan Simpson, member of the House of Representatives, representing Lincoln County.
Jerry Paxton, House of Representatives. I live in encampment, represent parts of Albany, Carbon, and Sweetwater counties.
Glenn Moniz, representing Senate District 10 from Albany County.
Lisa Henselmy Dalton, Senate District 12, Sweetwater County.
Stan Blake, Select Water Committee, House District 39, Sweetwater County.
Katie Talbot, Water Development Office.
Jason Mead, normally the Deputy Director of Dams and Reservoirs, today acting like the Director.
Ricky Green, Water Development Office.
Chris Brown, supervisor the water section of the Wyoming Attorney General's Office.
Larry Lawrence, Water Development Office. Rick, City of Cheyenne Water Facility. Ken Hamilton, Conjurer. Greg Kerr, University of Wyoming Office of Water Programs. Here, State State of
Okay, Mr. Hicks, you want to tell you if you're here or not here?
Here.
Okay, we have a quorum, so I guess we're ready to start with Savory Creek. That's the first one we have on the agenda.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, as you recall, at the March meeting, we had quite a lengthy discussion about the Savory Creek in-stream flow in the workshop. Lasted well over an hour, so the intent is not to have another hour-long discussion and rehash everything we talked about last meeting, but just wanted to, I guess, maybe make some observations and then throw it out for discussion. So Savory Creek in-stream flow, just so everybody's aware, and I'll just kind of try to paraphrase, but be pretty accurate here on the application. So when storage is available, and this is from the municipal and environmental account of High Savory Reservoir, releases up to 1,000 acre-feet from that account can be released to maintain a minimum of 10 CFS from July 15 to September 30th. And then it also goes on to say that that releases may also be made from that same account to augment stream flows as approved by the commission that do not conflict with the contractor's reservoir water supply at other times during the year. And it also says during dry cycles, water for in-stream flow purposes may not be available. So the contractor being, assuming the Little Snake River Water Conservancy District, who we have an agreement to sell water to. So basically what this means is any water that is released out of the municipal environmental account can basically be protected for in-stream flow is what it's asking for. I know at the last meeting and upon further discussion, well, and one other thing is the statutes say when we get a stream segment from the Game and Fish Commission, that the Water Development Commission shall apply for that, that right. So under statute, we're required to do that, or you guys are required to do that. So from previous discussions, I think there was a couple things that have come up that have caused some consternation. One of them being that it wasn't felt like we followed statute in regards to reporting findings of our feasibility study to the legislature. And since about 2014, what we've been doing is basically listing the names of the feasibility reports that have been completed by our office in the legislative report. That report goes to the legislature every year, full legislature. So could we have done a better job? Probably, in reporting the details and the findings, but we have provided at least the fact that we've had these reports, and of course they're available through our website. So the plan moving forward on that would be to, I guess if you so choose, Mr. Chairman, we would provide a little bit more detail on the findings of our feasibility reports, in particular, the ones that are still in the application phase. We've got about 18 of those during our next legislative, or within our next legislative report, this next session. And then moving forward on any new applications and feasibility reports, provide more findings of those reports to the legislature. So that's one thing I wanted to make a comment about. Another point that was made at the last meeting, it was in regards to the 1,000 acre feet municipal and environmental pool and what's available for the in-stream flow. And a comment was made about, well, I think the Conservancy District has some contracts for some of that water, or a portion of their 14,000 acre feet, which is what we sell them through an agreement with Baggs and Dixon. And I think the number was roughly 300 acre feet. So, and I think the thought was that maybe there was some misinformation provided through the feasibility report saying that there's 1,000 acre feet available, and then through other. So basically the feasibility report stated that the 1,000 acre feet has filled every year based on our records, because the way our agreement with the Conservancy District is set up is those pools, that pool or pool of water above the minimum pool, or the inviolate conservation pool for recreation, fills first, because we need to make sure we've got that water in the reservoir so we can meet our 404 permit conditions first and foremost. If we don't meet those, then we're all in a bad situation. So our agreement with the Conservancy District, that top 14,000 acre feet basically fills last. They've got the top of the reservoir. So our records show, and we know that we have filled that 1,000 acre feet every year. And that's what the feasibility study said. And it also made a comment that there's adequate supply exists for the in-stream flow application. So then the application itself for in-stream flow states that up to 1,000 acre feet from the pool to be released as necessary to maintain 10 CFS. So it doesn't say 1,000 feet have to be released. It just says up to, and doesn't say 10 CFS has to be released and protected. It's up to that 10 CFS to maintain. So if we have 5 CFS coming into the reservoir and we can bypass that, during that time where we need to release 10 CFS for our 404 permit, then we only need to supplement it with another 5 CFS. So just that 5 CFS coming out of that municipal and environmental pool would be protected by that in-stream flow. And the other comment in regards to the 1,000 acre feet is we don't know, I'm doubting that the municipalities of Baggs and Dixon take delivery of that every year. So there will be years when we have up to 1,000 acre feet. There may be years when we don't have up to 1,000 acre feet, depending on if they use that water for municipal water. The other point I guess I'd like to make, or just throw out in response to some of the discussion at the last meeting, was in regards to the 10 CFS at other times during the year. Because as I mentioned, the application says we can supplement or augment stream flows as approved by the commission that do not conflict with the contractor's reservoir water supply. In the I think it was the public hearing announcement or notice. It did say 10 CFS or up to 10 CFS. I've got that somewhere in here if we need the exact wording, and then it stated the dates of October 1 to July 14th, basically the rest of the year outside that July 15th to September 30th window. And I think that was thought that was probably providing misinformation during the public hearings. And you could argue that was. It's really left unsaid on what the rate could be in the application at other times during the year. It only talks to the July 15th to September 30th. But if you don't put a rate in there, what are we debating? I guess we need to have something to talk about. In reality, it probably doesn't matter because we're really only talking about when water is released from that 1,000-acre-foot pool. That's what can be protected, and only up to 10 CFS at that July 15th to September 30th timeframe. So what do we do the rest of the year? Is it up to 10 CFS? Can be as much as we want. Is it 0? I don't know. So whether that's misinformation or not, it's kind of a gray area in the application to start with. And then the last point I want to make is in regards to conflict, that those other times during the year, does that provide a conflict with the contractor's reservoir supply? And it says during the water year. So if we're getting hung up on semantics here, during the water year, is that the same water year we're talking about when we filled that pool? I don't know. If it is, then probably doesn't affect it. If we're talking about the next water year, well, the fact that we took water out of that pool, that environmental municipal pool, and in the next spring, when we go to fill the reservoir again, we have to fill that pool first before we start filling the irrigation pool. You could make the argument that we're conflicting with their water supply that next year. So I just wanted to provide that information to you guys. And at this point, I think I'll just throw it open for discussion for the commission, select water committee, and whoever.
Mr. Chairman,
Or go ahead.
tall, handsome stranger is what I
Yeah.
I'm confused about the 300-acre foot. Does it come out of our district's pool, or does it come out of the 1,000-acre feet that they're selling to the municipalities?
So in our agreement, it doesn't specify really where water comes from, I wouldn't say. So when they sell it, it's selling it through our agreement, Mr. Chairman, with the Conservancy District. So it's coming out of their 14,000 acre feet. Now, that's an agreement between two parties. When we talk to the state engineer's office and they report how the water was used, well, that 300 acre feet would most likely come out of that municipal and environmental pool if it was used for municipal use.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay,
Mr. Chairman,
Purcell.
I'm somewhat concerned about you kind of alluded to the fact that we didn't need to set an amount in terms of how much water. And that makes me nervous. I don't know. I feel like there could be times when the whole 1,000 acre foot would be gone. I think maybe we need to put some arms around ourselves as to how we intend to operate this. But anyway, that's just a point I guess I'm making. I was concerned. I'm less concerned about it this meeting than I was last meeting, but I still would like to see some more meat on the bones of the application of what they are really seeking, what they think the fish need, and when they want it. So maybe I would suggest we ask them to clarify their application, but that's just me, and I will certainly go with the flow on this, but I am kind of nervous about how open-ended it is.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, when the public notice went out from the Game and Fish, and I don't know if It basically says reservoir releases up to 10 CFS may also be made in the October 1 to July 14th timeframe from the said pool to maintain existing fisheries. And then it kind of states the same language. So it tried to put that boundary on there. Again, as it was interpreted, maybe that was an incorrect thing to do because it doesn't exactly match what the original application says. It is left unsaid. So.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I'm more comfortable about May because it does leave it in the hands of the commission, I guess. But it seems we need to get our arms around what kind of commitment we are willing to provide under that May. And keeping in mind the effects on our contractor and, as you noted, dry year refills and things like that. Maybe up to 10 CFS is okay, but I'd be interested in what other people think.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Super.
you mentioned municipality water. What's the priority of the municipality? What pool are they in? Are they in the pool we're talking about or something less?
Mr. Chairman, it's a bit of a complicated question. If you were looking at how the state engineer's office is going to look at it, when they try to say there was this much water used for this use out of the reservoir in a given year, they're going to see that in that pool that would fill sooner than the irrigation pool or the water sales agreement pool, as we might call it. However, we're selling, or I should say the Conservancy District is selling out water through their agreement to Baggs and Dixon, and their water is the top 14,000 acre feet. So it, like I said, it's a complicated question and answer.
There is a chance,
Go ahead.
Chairman, that if that pool was drawn down to that lower pool, that there wouldn't be any water for that municipality. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, I guess I would say that if all the water was released from the 1,000 acre foot municipal and environmental pool for the in-stream flow, and then the municipality called for delivery of their water from the Conservancy District, then we would most likely say, okay, well, there's no water yet there. Can we do a temporary change in water use to transfer water from the irrigation pool to make up for that 300 acre feet? Would probably be how we would handle that.
Okay, I answered my question, my concern.
Any other discussions? Okay.
Down here. I guess I'm on. Is it correct that the 10 CFS per day would be 20 acre feet? And so we'd have 50 days worth of use?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. If I can expand upon that for just a minute. Like I mentioned, if we have inflow into the reservoir, we bypass that inflow at that time of the year, July 15 to September 30th timeframe. If it's a dry year, I'll use last year for example. I'm guessing in July we had 7 CFS coming into the reservoir. We were bypassing that water. So our 404 permit requires us to bypass 10 CFS, regardless of inflows, from July 15 to September 30th. So at that point in time, we would have been supplementing that 7 bypass with 3 from that account. So 3 of those CFS that would have been able to be protected by that in-stream flow. And I would want to expand on that even more. We could talk about last year, and we ran from anywhere from inflows from 7 to down to a little less than 4 CFS from that time period. If we would have had to have supplied that the whole time with no irrigation water being released, we would have used about 725 acre feet based on the inflows we had last year to meet that 10 going out. What happened was irrigation turned on July 20th, I want to say, and ran till August 25th or so, about a month. And because of that, that satisfied our 404 requirements. So we were on the shoulders of where we needed to supplement, and we only used, I think, 430 some acre feet, if you were keeping track of that out of the environmental pool, if that in-stream flow would have been in place.
Mr. Chairman,
Pat, or Mike.
tall, handsome stranger. I guess, I would still like to see you or someone develop some criteria as to when we might be willing to provide the 10 CFS up and above, over and above what we're required to do for our 404 permit. I don't know if that criteria is, if the reservoir's full May 1st, we'll do it. 2/3 full May 1st. 80% full May 1st. But I would at least like something a little more than the commission may. I think we owe it to our customers to know what the limits of what we may do would have on their operation.
Mr. Chairman, in years past, and it's different every year, obviously, in really wet years where we're spilling water, there's not an issue because we're typically spilling until we start releasing for irrigation. They're pretty dang close. Last year, for example, I don't remember specifics, but there's typically a bottleneck, as we've called it in the past, from when air temperatures start increasing and we've got 80+ degree, 90 degree weather in June or early July, where we're slightly concerned about the fisheries downstream, but it's before we've turned on for irrigation releases. And those are the times where we all talk, Game and Fish, as well as the Conservancy District and Senator Hicks and our office, about, hey, what can we do? Can we bump that? Because at that time, our 404 permit says we have to have at least 12 going out the outlet. But that warms up pretty quick as it moves downstream when it's 90 degrees out. So if we can supplement that and feel good that we're going to be able to meet our requirements and have water where we don't go into the violet pool and everything else, then we'll try to do that. But we're all talking as a group when we do that. And it's typically, we might go to 20 CFS total, or sometimes maybe 25. In the past, we've experimented and it's backfired on us a few times. So it's been a learning experience, but that's typically how it's done. And by the time you get to the end of irrigation season, you have cool nights and the days are still pretty warm, but it cools off enough at night where you don't have to be too worried about it in September. So we've been getting along pretty well, I think, so far.
Mr. Chairman, I think Jason's done a pretty good job of characterizing the issues, and it is extremely complicated, but not to complicate the issue anymore. But one of the issues is you have 1,000 acres specified under the permit that's for municipal and environmental uses. And then there's an additional pool of water so the bottom of the reservoir is about 5,700 acre feet specified for fisheries. That's the minimum environmental, or the fisheries pool that we main. And then the next pool is that 1,000 acre feet specified under the permit for municipal and environmental purposes. That's the 300 acre feet that's contracted out of that pool for the 2 municipalities. Then that sets on top of that. There is another pool of water of about 15,000 acre feet, which includes irrigation, and I can't remember what the other specific use is, recreation. And that's the way the water rights are filed. Working with staff, and then actually I make the recommendations to work with the office on the releases of that. But we went back, and one of the questions I asked is how much water do we annually evaporate from the reservoir? And that can be, as you know, based on the surface area, somewhere between the neighborhoods of 800 to 1,000 acre feet of water could be evaporated on a normal year. It's going to range in there depending on how full the reservoir is and what the evaporative demand is. But question I've asked on that, where does that come out of? And if you go back in some of the early documentation, it would suggest that that was part of the intent of that environmental pool, was to cover the evaporation. Or does it come out of the recreation pool? Or does it come out of the irrigation pool? Or is evaporation attributed across all of those accounts? So I think it gets to the point that Director Purcell comes back is from the contractor side, we just absolutely do not know how much water is available for in-stream flows and which pool that's coming from and how is the evaporation being debited against those accounts. And I think those answers we need to go through that exercise of making that determination. That's just the technical side of the issue. And then you've got the conflicting issues between, the contract that you have with your operator is the commission. Basically says there's really only 500 acre feet of water available left in that M&I pool in the contract. It says there would be left 500 acre feet in there for in-basin municipal use. So if you reserve that for that 500 acre feet out of that M&I pool, because the environmental water is the stuff that we're looking at being filing on for the in-stream flow, there's only 500. That's the contract. And then you deal with the 700 that's available in the whole pool. And then you have the stuff that was put out in the public information that it could be up to 1,000 acre feet. Very well may be 1,000 acre feet, but whose pool is that coming out of? Is that going to come out of the recreation? Because the state engineers has to debit that back against how those water rights were filed. So these are the issues that I think that is a little confusing, that we need a little more clarification on. So just to add some more confusion to the confusing issue at hand.
Mr. Chairman, you certainly confused me. You threw out two more numbers, the 300 and the 5. Well, first conflict is the 300 you're selling Bags and Dixon. I thought that was coming out of your 14,000.
The 14,000, it comes out of there, but it doesn't specify what pools in the contract specifically. But if you're selling municipal water, that needs to be debited against the municipal pool in the reservoir. So, which means that we're taking 13,700 out of the 15,000 irrigation recreation pool under the contract.
Mr. Chairman, who gets the money from the water sales to the municipalities?
That comes back as the payment under the contract to the Water Development Commission. The contractor is the Water Conservancy District. They collect those funds annually. At the last meeting, I supplied you guys a copy of those receipts that had been received, and then as that contract is paid back to the Water Development Program.
Mr. Chairman, our latest fee for per acre foot of water is $2.90 to the district, and I'm not sure what they then charge their users.
But the municipalities have paid that fee annually, and then we remit that fee back to the commission.
Mr. Chairman, roughly in a given year, it's $40,000 for that, whatever accumulates to the 14,000 acre foot pool that they've got.
Mr. Chairman, is it a condition of the contract that all those revenues come back as their service fees? Here's my concern. It seems to me the 1,000 acre feet pool belongs to the Water Development Commission. Okay.
Well as every other pool, yeah.
Yeah. So the reality is, if that pool is getting debited by the 300 acre feet, which then it seems like we ought to be getting the money. But
Mr. Chairman, I would say that we are getting the money that we are charging to the district for that water. Now, if they're charging the municipality $10, we're not getting the difference. Just like if they charge their irrigators an admin fee or whatever, we're not getting the difference.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have as much trouble with the pool that we're contracted for. I'm just nitpicking, if you will, this 300 acre feet. And where maybe it's good, but the consistency of the whole thing would be if it's coming out of one of our pools, we ought to be selling the water and taking the money toward our operating expenses. But if you think that this is working fine, I'll shut up. But that seems, in trying to allocate this 1,000 acre feet, it seems to me like right now we have 1,000 acre feet because the 300 is coming out of the 16,000. So it seems to me there's a question of allocation. What do we really have in our municipal environmental pool? If I hear him right, it's 700. If I hear you right, it's 1,000.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's depending on if they take delivery of the water to one of those municipalities. If they take 300 acre feet of water in a given year, then we have 700. If they don't take delivery, then there's 1,000. Or if they take a little bit of delivery, then it's somewhere in between. As far as selling directly to the municipalities, we could do that. Then the question would be back on the commission. Are we going to charge them a higher rate than what we're charging the Conservancy District? If so, then we get a little bit more revenue. If not, then we don't. And it works well the way it is working because it's one less contract and two fewer people to deal with on our end, but seems to be working okay at this point, I think.
We're not looking for any changes right now then.
I guess if we get back to the in-stream flow application, we have two options I see, and that would be, move forward, provide the information to the legislature this late fall, winter during legislative session. We've met statutes at that point, and let the state engineer make their decision. Or I guess the other option is the commission could decide to withdraw that application since you're the applicant and the holder of that application.
Any comments on that one?
Mr. Chairman, at the very least, I think we ought to say that, in the notice it said 1,000 acre foot, that number ought to be 700 if that's truly the case. If what I'm hearing is, I think you need to hold that in reserve. I don't know if we have in fact obligated 300 acre foot out of the environmental municipal pool, then I think we only have 700 left. Now, I know you're going to say they have never called for water, but they might. And I know you're saying we have the flexibility to go to the 1,000 if they don't call for the water. But the reality of it is, under worst case conditions, we only got 700 acre feet.
Chairman, the only comment I don't disagree with you is that when we provided the information, it said up to 1,000 acre feet. It didn't say 1,000 for sure. And the other point I would make is that the application is talking about any water that comes out of that pool is protected. It doesn't say it has to be 1,000, it has to be a 700 or anything else. It's just whatever water comes out of that pool is protected. So.
Just one real quick point of clarification. It says 1,000 acre, but it does specify what pool that would come out of. It would be the M&O pool in the application. And I think that gets back to Director Purcell. 300 acre feet of that's already been contracted out of that pool. So technically that becomes a misrepresentation of how much water is available for releases for in-stream flow.
You want to work up something for tomorrow when you're in session, or?
So Mr. Chairman, is what you're asking that we provide a new feasibility memo that says 700, or at least explains it may only be 700 based on the municipal agreements through the Conservancy District, and then have another public hearing. I guess that part of it would be up to the state engineer's office, but.
Mr. Chairman, I'd suggest we do nothing with this tomorrow. And that you and the Game and Fish get together. You've heard the debate and discussion. And then jointly come back to us with a recommendation for August. I don't think the state engineer's office has any burning desire to smack the gavel down on this puppy. So let's make sure we get it right and understand what we're doing.
Chairman, do we have Game and Fish in the audience today?
They want to speak up, they better.
If we all can agree that we'll just change the number in the memo and then have another public hearing, then that's pretty easy. But we can talk about it too and come back to the August meeting.
Well, we'll have to see what they got to say. Get your name, rank, and file.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Del Lobb. I'm in-stream flow biologist with Game and Fish. Just a few quick comments. Part of the in-stream flow application, the in-stream flow application was based on a study in 1997 that was part of the evaluation for the permitting process of the reservoir. And that 1977 recommendation said 10 cubic feet per second from actually July 1 through September 30. In the negotiations and evaluation of hydrology and biology, that got changed to July 15th to September 30th. And the other times of year was based on some habitat modeling that was done for up to 12 CFS. Through the years, and as we learn more, and in discussions between the agencies, that's where it became to be in January of this year, 10 cubic feet per second, primarily July 15th through September 30th, but potentially other times of year depending on need. The main point of that, the need for the in-stream flow segment and water right, is to protect the water, not just to the base of the dam, but through the entire 20 or so mile in-stream flow segment. So that's the key difference between just having water released from the dam, but having protection down to that downstream end of the reach. And I would point out that the application also says that, I won't get the language exactly right, but it says during dry cycles, there may not be water available for the in-stream flow. And so it was never intended for that 1,000 acre feet, or if you want to say 500 acre feet for environmental or 500 acre feet for municipal, it was never intended that amount of water would cover every situation that might come along. That if the water runs out, then it runs out. So, but we'll be happy to work with staff if deemed necessary to revise the application. But I will point out that Game and Fish, Water Development, and SEO met in January at least once, maybe twice, to talk about this application. And at that point, that's where we decided that, hey, the application doesn't specify any quantity for those other times of the year. Originally, it was thought that the original study said 12 CFS, but you can't increase from 10 to 12 without changing the priority date of the application. So we all agreed that 10 CFS should be for that other times of year. And all three agencies, Game and Fish paid for the public announcement, but the language was developed by SEO and Water Development in that public notice.
Questions? Thank you, sir. Done with that subject?
Mr. Chairman, we will move on to the next subject.
Yeah, Gladden.
All right, Mr. Chairman, if you recall, I believe it was last again, March and May meetings of last year. Director Labonte brought to you a water service agreement for the town of Aladdin. And at the time, I believe the water service agreement was expiring, and that was to sell them water. So let me back up a second. So the town of Aladdin has a well that was drilled in 1995 through our program. Series of events occurred, and what ended up happening was we were directed to sell them water out of that well for the time being, instead of them purchasing it at that time. So that's all we do is it's our well. They have the pump in the well. They have the transmission line. Everything else past that, excuse me, is theirs. So anyway, last year, and this well, again, drilled in 1995, is 25 years old or so. Last year, Director Labonte suggested that they should go ahead and purchase that well from the Water Development Office, and then they're in charge of their system, and we're relieved of that liability, and everybody will be happy. And he extended that water service agreement, which you could really term as a water sales agreement, because we're really not providing them more service than just the well. So he gave them a year to then go ahead and try to purchase that. So since that time, about the time the town of Aladdin was up for sale, a year and a half ago or so, I think EPA, I don't know, talked to the town and suggested they should be doing some water quality sampling and cleaning of tanks and this and that. So this is in tab V of your notebooks.
Say that again, Jason.
V is in victory. So they had the town of Aladdin had some expenditures associated with that. What's in tab V here is basically a letter from Nicole Schuler, who is the vice president of the Aladdin Water District. And I'll just read here briefly. About a year and a half ago, our district was contacted by EPA about our water system and some items that need to be brought up to date to meet their standards. We had to clean our tanks, extend the lids, put new seals on, build and install lock systems on the lids and other small things. We had little money in our reserves at that time, and with the cost of the upgrades that were needed, it depleted their reserves significantly. Since then, in August of this year, they raised their rates to help restore some of those reserves. But during that time and with that effort and their ongoing water quality sampling that they have to do, they haven't built those back up to where they'd like to see them. And that's what's caused them to basically not act on the purchase of that well to date. However, and you can read on, but I'll just paraphrase. So last year when we were talking about this, in 1995, the cost of the well to our office to drill was $85,641. And as is standard practice when we drill a well for a community, when we get done with the level 2 and we call it level 3, we'll sell them that well for 33% of the cost. That's just what we've done forever. So that was our proposition to them, was you can buy the well for 33% of that cost, which is $28,261.53. So since that time, the district, Aladdin Water District, has gotten on the intended use plan list, which makes them eligible then for the drinking water SRF program, which is a loan program. And I think our office has been pointing a lot of municipalities to that funding because, well, I don't know all the reasons, but anyway, it provides a better loan interest rate. It's 2.5%. Ours is 4%. And there's money that we're matching with federal government EPA, so it makes sense to use their money rather than state money. So anyway, they got on the IUP list, eligible. They just recently submitted an application for SRF funding, and it's got to go through a process. I believe the next State Land Investment Board meeting is in August. And then if they approve their application, then it moves through a part 2 of the application process, which is 4 or 5 months, I've been told. And so they may be having some funding around the first of the year. So they've got a plan moving forward. They're they're in a situation they don't have a lot of money. It's not a community that has a very high median household income. So they may get some breaks potentially through the SRF program as far as potential loan forgiveness or reduction of their interest rates. So I think we can make it affordable for them. And they've agreed or stated that they want to purchase that well from us for the amount that we originally had stated to them last year. However, they need some more time to go through this process. I would say if for some reason that process doesn't work out for them, there's mineral royalties grant that they could potentially apply for next year, or they could come through our program and ask for a loan to purchase that as well. So they've asked for a 1-year extension. I wrote the water sales agreement renewal for 2 years, just because in a perfect world, we'll get it done in a year, but we all know it's not a perfect world. So I don't want to have to come back to you guys again next year because something fell through the cracks or this took too much longer than expected. But be assured that we'll keep working with them and move this along as quickly as possible. So with that, I guess I'd ask if there's any questions. There's no action to be taken on this today. I do have it as an action item tomorrow, but I wanted to have the discussion today. So tomorrow we can just handle it and move on because we'll have a lot of guests tomorrow.
Questions, Chairman? How many taps are on that one, Jason?
They've got 13 taps currently.
The town's shrinking in size or growing?
It's pretty stagnant. I mean, it depends how many trailers they have in their trailer court at the time, pretty much. They've got 5. They had 7 a couple months ago. So
is there an indication that the EPA is going to keep pressure on them? When you got that small of a system and the EPA charges you $400 a month for your microscopic test,
yeah,
can they recover?
Mr. Chairman, they're working with, I think it's the water guy out of Gillette to do their testing for them. And I want to say it's about $150 a month or so. And besides that, their really only expense is power to run the pumps. And that's $50, $60 a month. And like I said, they just raised their rates not too long ago. That's, I think, $40 a tap now. So they've got 500 plus coming in. They've got 200 or so going out with this. If they get their loan for SRF, that'll be about $150 a month. So they'll be able to pay for that as well as, and that's 20-year term, as well as start building up their reserves and build up their reserves in the meantime too. So I think they'll be in pretty good shape.
Mr. Chair.
Suko.
Jason, is that water metered with a master meter?
Mr. Chairman, yes, it is.
Okay. And do you know what that number is?
Mr. Chairman, it's varied
On a
over the years,
yearly
but
base?
on average in a year, they'll use about 150,000 gallons. So on average, we're getting about $300 a year from them for this water. If we sell it to them for 28,000, that's about 90 some years worth of selling it to them at $300 a year. So it's in our best interest, I think,
Good
as well to
return
sell
on
it,
investment, in other words.
I suppose.
Thank you.
Okay, that take care of that one?
So tomorrow, Mr. Chairman, I hope we can just fly right through that and say, yep, let's approve it.
I think we can, but we'll have a new guy head of the helm.
Okay. Okay, so next on our list is the consultant selection procedures. Our office follows the Professional Architectural Engineering and Land Service or Surveying Services Procurement Act when we go through consultant selection for planning. And based on some statute changes in the last legislative session through Senate File 74 and House Bill 65, mainly 74, we've had to react and modify our consultant selection procedures a little bit for this coming year. So Barry's going to tell you all about that.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, Select Water. As Jason said, I'm going to walk you through some changes we're going to be implementing for consultant selection so that we comply with the changes in legislation.
We don't have it in, you're just telling us what's happening.
And
We don't have it in
in
our.
Tabo, if you go to Tabo in your notebook,
Tabo.
Mr. Chairman, you'll find not only the legislation, a summary of the legislation, and then also a one-pager that has been provided in the format we typically do for the selection process that explains how we're going to be implementing this shortlisting process as affected by the changes in statute. So I'll walk you through that. And as Jason has indicated, there were two bills that came through the legislature or passed by the legislature this year that that are going to alter a little bit what we do and how we do business relative to consultant selection. And when I'm talking about consultant selection here, I'm talking about level 1, 2 planning projects. Okay. So the first one, House Bill 65, went into effect, is signed into law by the governor, went into effect immediately. And it's House Bill 65, which is procurement amendments. And that's not in your notebook. And the reason it's not in your notebook, it had very minimal impact to our program and the way we do business. It is Chapter 134 in the session laws. It had to do with thresholds for notification, publication, for interviews, proposals, and so forth when we asked for those things from competing firms. And just so you know, they were upping the thresholds in most of those cases from 25K to 50K. Well, obviously, most of our planning projects, or majority, 99% of them are going to be above 50K. And so therefore, this didn't really impact us. The one thing that did impact us in this bill, House Bill 65, was that it reduced the number of number of times that we had to that we were required to publish solicitation for these projects. So that solicitation for the project, instead of being published for 4 successive weeks, is down to 2. And that's really the only change relative to House Bill 65. So that's why I didn't provide that to you. It's very minimal change and more housekeeping on our side. The big change, as Jason has alluded to, is Senate File 74, which is the professional services procurement. And that is codified in session laws, Chapter 185. And one of the things it did was it went back and looked at the definition of professional services. And just so we're all on the same page, professional services refers to professional architectural, engineering, and land surveying. So that's what we're dealing with here. And the basic tenets, it went and looked at the selection processes, procedures, which is 9-2-1031, which we follow every year. And the basic, to get to the heart of the matter, what it does, it requires us to select resident firms for professional services. We have to select resident firms for professional services unless we have less than 3 firms having come in that are resident, or if the resident firms are determined to be not qualified. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about definitions here. First of all, resident firm, and I want to make sure we get this right so everybody understands. Based on the definition, resident firm is a firm that possesses a physical office within the state that is staffed by individuals with professional and technical expertise who are employed in the state. That's the first thing. And then number 2, to be a resident firm, that firm has to certify in the firm's current statement of qualifications that if selected for the project, 50% of the contract costs for professional services shall be performed by qualified individuals or consultants employed in the state who will perform their labor or professional services provided under the contract within state boundaries. Okay, so that's the 2 tenets, and that's the definition of resident firm, which was further clarified through this act. The other thing we should mention is qualified. We've talked about qualified firms. So what does that mean? Qualified means not only the ability of professional personnel, but certainly past performance. And that would also mean, have they done this type of project before? That's very critical. And so consideration of firms will be looked at, those things you'll see there also in the handout that you have been provided, the list of things that can be used to determine those firms that shall be selected and so forth, and we use those on a regular basis. So the next thing is, okay, knowing these changes and what's happened here, residency of 3 firms or less, and how do we handle it? So how are we going to implement this? Okay, so residency screening has always been the first cut. When we do shortlisting for consultants, when we get those statements of qualification, statements of interest, we've always done the residency screening in the first cut, and that won't change, okay? What's going to be changing is how we apply that and the number, depending on the number of firms that come in. So I would ask you to look at the yellow highlighted section there. So you can see, and I'll kind of walk you through this. Our goal has always been to have 5 qualified firms as part of that short list. That's where we've been. I think the commissioners certainly that have been involved in this process know that's what we strive for, to get 5 qualified firms on that short list, such that they can provide the necessary professional services. And we want to get as many, get those 5 proposals, so we have a lot to go through and consider. That has always been our goal, to get the 5 qualified firms for the short list. That having been said, and let me go through this. Point number 1, if there are 5 or more qualified resident firms, 5 of those firms shall be selected, okay? That's no different than what we've been doing. If we have 5 or more, we've always making that first cut, Wyoming firms. If they're qualified, they have to be qualified, but if we have 5 qualified Wyoming firms, those firms shall be selected. If we get 6 or 7 Wyoming firms, we still narrow it down to the 5 Wyoming qualified firms. Out-of-state firms are not selected at that first cut, okay? And in that case, where we have 5 or more qualified Wyoming firms, out-of-state firms aren't in the hunt, okay? Moving on, if we only had 4 qualified resident firms come in, well, then those 4 firms shall be selected for the shortlist, okay? In the past, I will tell you the way we used to do business under the old system, if we had only 4 Wyoming qualified firms come in, we would then add additional out-of-state firms to get to the 5. If they were qualified, we'd come up with 1 more to get to the 5. Based on this new law and the way it reads, we will not be doing that anymore. If we have 4 qualified Wyoming firms, we stop at 4 qualified Wyoming firms, okay? Then the next point, if there are 3 qualified resident firms, and again, much like the 4, if we have 3 qualified Wyoming firms, we're done. If we have 3 qualified, they've got to be qualified, but if they have 3 qualified resident firms come in, then that is our short list. We won't be rounding out to the 5 to get, additional 2 out-of-state firms to get to 5. In the past, we would have, okay? And then the last cut, the point 4 there, if, and this is where the other part of the bill goes into play, if we have less, how do we handle it if we have less than 3 Wyoming qualified firms come in? Well, then, if we have less than 3 qualified firms, then we are looking to add non-resident firms to round out or to come up with a short list of 5. And that's the way we would have done business in the past. If we had had 2 or 1 Wyoming firms come in, we still are trying to get to that 5. We would have added, provided they're qualified, come up with the best qualified and round out to get to the 5. So that didn't really change. So what's changing here is if you have 3 or 4 Wyoming qualified firms come in, you're done. That's it. Those are the ones you will go forward with your short list. So your short list won't be made up of 5. It'll be made up of 4 or 3. Okay. So in a nutshell, if 3 or more Wyoming qualified firms come in for any project, out-of-state firms will not be considered for shortlisting. Qualified Wyoming firms. I don't know if Jason, you want to add anything more about that?
Any questions? It came pretty clear to me.
I do have, Mr. Chairman. Are you using the state statute to determine who are not qualified firms, but who are in-state contractors?
Right. Well, based on
is this base a little different?
Well, it's 9-2-28 deals with the residency. One of the things they're going to have to do is certify that they are adhering to this and that 50% of the work is being conducted in-state by employees in the state of Wyoming. They're going to have to certify it not only, and I didn't go into all this, but at the shortlisting phase, at the statements of qualification and so forth, they're going to have to provide a certification. We're going to have a certification form that they're going to have to fill out if they're claiming residency status that they'll submit with that. Okay. And that carries through with them. Even when we get into contracting, the statute, and I didn't talk about this, it also talks about how in the contract itself, there's going to have to be a statement that they are a resident firm if they're claiming that, and they're going to adhere to these things based on those tenets that we laid out of the percentage of the work.
Mr. Chairman, I would say, and to answer your question, this refers only to professional services of engineering, architecture, and surveying. It's not general contracting to move dirt and things like that. This is just professional services that we're talking about here.
The statute only deals with these terms.
Right. That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Mike, I have a question of our partners. What was the genesis of this particular statute?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Purcell, and I don't know specifically the focus of this program, but it really had a heavy discussion revolving around the hundreds of millions of dollars that we've spent on school capital construction in the state in the last decade. And the vast majority of those have come from out-of-state architectural firms. And so the idea was to bring more of the work back home into the state for these guys that are trying to get businesses established and running into the state. That said, most of it dealt with the discussion around the amount of money that we spent on school capital construction, not this program. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Senator Hicks.
In other words, we're kind of tiring our hands a little bit. Okay, anybody else? I guess we're all done with that one.
All right, Mr. Chairman, the I guess last item, we're moving right along here, is the Drought
What we're
River.
supposed to do.
That's right. You're doing a good job. Is the Colorado River Drought Contingency Plan, and we've got a update from Mr. Chris Brown from the State Engineer's Office and our retired previous, I don't know what your title is, but
Upper Colorado River Commissioner.
oh yeah, upper. I'll just move out of the way.
Sorry. Do you want me to go another chair?
Nah.
Oh, Pat, glad to see you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Good to be here.
You don't look any different.
I don't look rested.
Well, you're too far away for us to see that.
Mr. Chairman, just to, Chris can probably do a lot of this, but just to update you, when I did retire a month and a half ago, I'd spoken with the governor prior to that and offered to stay on as Upper Colorado River Commissioner for Wyoming. He was agreeable to that, so I've not been removed from that position. And I continue to serve as the governor's representative to the 7 basin states on the Colorado. So that's why I'm here today.
You're on.
All right. We have a quick update, and I believe, I don't know what tab it's in, but you should have a
Two-page one-pager.
two-page one-pager with some teacup diagrams. I believe they're included.
No.
They're not? Okay.
B as in boy. Oh, as in Paul.
P as in
Paul.
Patrick.
Patrick. Tyrell. All they have is just this two-pager.
Okay, all right. I think it might help to get us going to just talk about current status, and then we'll go to where, back to the first page. When I previously have briefed this group, I think we were in the process of working on the DCP documents. We had gone on a public road trip in the fall, touring through the basin and here in Cheyenne with presentations on what the drought planning is. Since that time, we have seen federal legislation passed in early April, after some of us went back and testified in late March. President Trump signed that legislation into law on April 16th. And so that's important to know. The basin states will be collecting or gathering together at Hoover Dam on Monday to formalize the signing of those documents. And we'll move on from there. So things have happened fairly quick since March. Now let's go back and talk a little bit about what the drought contingency plans are. Over the last 6 years or thereabouts, we have realized in the Colorado River that the 07 guidelines weren't quite strong enough to, in the face of drought that was worse than we had seen and had planned for at that time, from the early 2000s. So those guidelines that we entered into in 07 are destined to be renegotiated starting next year and be done with that by 2026. Those guidelines, if you recall, were called the interim shortage guidelines and coordinated reservoir operations. They tied Lakes Mead and Powell a little closer together, and they provided that the lower basin states would take shortages if we hit critical trigger elevations in Lake Mead. We never did hit that trigger elevation, but we have hovered right at it for a couple of years now. And that elevation is 1075 in Lake Mead, but we know that there's a chance and a fairly high risk. I think in the lower basin, that risk is 50 or 60% now, that the lower basin will get into elevations below 1075 in Lake Mead, requiring either under the 07 guidelines that shortages be taken, or with the DCPs being signed, there will be voluntary conserved contributions made to Lake Mead to protect it from dropping too far too fast. It may still go below 1075, and that's when the drought contingency numbers really kick in. So the primary goals are protecting critical elevations for the lower basin in Lake Mead and for the upper basin in Lake Powell. The need for the upper basin is to protect our ability to comply with the 22 compact, and as best we can avoid curtailment of our post-1922 water right uses if we are in jeopardy of missing the 75 and 10 at Lee Ferry, which is our primary compact obligation. We cannot deplete the flow coming out of Lake Powell as measured at Lee Ferry below 75 million acre feet every 10 years as a running average. So that is what the documents are intended to do between now and 2026. What we get in the upper basin are two agreements, the Drought Response Operations Agreement and the Demand Management Storage Agreement. Both of these really accomplish little in themselves other than setting in motion the ability for us to create those programs. Under the Drought Response Operations Agreement, we are at the table if Lake Powell approaches 3525, which is a protective 35 feet above their hydropower limiting elevation of 3490, where they can't get water, we believe, out of the penstocks. But those operations, what the Bureau would do, we know they're not going to let Aspinall and Navajo and Flaming Gorge sit there brim full with Lake Powell suffering at that point. They will move uncommitted water down to Lake Powell. What the agreement does is give the states a place at the table to help influence how that is done and not consider any kind of drought response operations complete until we have recovered the reservoirs that were used in that way. Flaming Gorge, unfortunately, on the Wyoming-Utah line is probably the biggest, not probably, it is the biggest of the three with the most uncommitted storage. So that's the one that probably would be eyed first. However, the agreement says they will look at every one of those initial units, including Navajo and the Aspinall unit in Colorado. And when I say Aspinall, if you've ever heard of Blue Mesa, Morrow Point, Morrow and Crystal Point.
Mm-hmm.
Close enough, huh, Chris? Close enough for a non-attorney on the Gunnison River, right above the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. In any case, they will move water down from those reservoirs. That the agreement gets us a seat at the table and puts recovery of those reservoirs as part of the plan so that we can get water back into Flaming Gorge if that's what happens. The Demand Management Storage Agreement makes available uncommitted storage or unfilled storage in the federal reservoirs, likely Lake Powell, but it's not committed to Lake Powell just yet, for us to put water in if we can stand up a demand management program. Demand management would be the intentional, compensated, voluntary conservation or non-use of water, being able to track it legally and technically down the river to Lake Powell. We would have a bucket to put that water in. It would not be released except for compact compliance purposes, and it would not be used to determine tiers for operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So we don't have that program stood up yet. What the legislation did was get us the authorization to use federal storage in that way. If we did, and the current number is 500,000 acre feet of space. If we did not have that commitment in federal law, it would have made very little sense for us to try and stand up a program, because we know we can't conserve enough water in 1 year to get ourselves out of a compliance issue. So we need to conserve year over year if and when such a program is stood up, hence the need for the storage. So that's really in a nutshell what the two agreements get us. We also understand, we've had quite a bit of public input as we went out and about in the fall, that both of these, whether it's drought response operations of the reservoirs to protect Lake Powell or the demand management storage program, demand management, will need public input, and we will seek public input on how to do that. All this does is essentially give you the sticks and the nails to build your house, but we'll need help building that house. So you can expect a much more robust public involvement, meetings, things like that in the basin as these programs stand up. The Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan, which I mentioned briefly, really allows for all three lower basin states to contribute through conservation to protecting levels in Lake Mead. They're going to leave water unused in Lake Mead. One of the key things there is California is in the game. They don't enter until we hit about elevation 1045, but as the senior water right holder in the lower basin, they don't have to play at all, but they're at the table, and that's good. They recognize that from a political and emotional and river basin health point of view, they need to have some skin in the game. 2 years ago, Mexico, in the signing of Minute 323, and we've talked about minutes to treaties in the past, it's essentially an interpretation or a document that says, here's how the United States and Mexico will approach a specific topic. 2 years ago, Mexico signed, when we approved Minute 323, there is a section in there called their water scarcity plan. It's Mexico's, in essence, leaving water in Lake Mead or taking shortages that is also enabled by the signing of the DCP document. So they too will be contributing water into Lake Mead. The section of the minute could not be operable until the lower basin DCP is signed. As soon as it is, Mexico and the 3 lower basin states will immediately begin putting conservation in place in Lake Mead. The upper basin stuff has no immediate physical on the ground actions that go along with it. We just have the freedom now to stand up 2 programs. So in a nutshell, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission and Select Water, that's where we're at. That's what the documents do. And that's why we're headed to Nevada Monday morning.
Any questions? Mr. Chairman, I do have a question. Over here, Gerald. What happens if we stand up a demand management program and, as you said, use the sticks and build us a house? What's to prevent the lower basin states from tearing their house down?
Of course, the whole DCP package was all built together, and they're tied together with what's called a companion agreement. And as we build potentially, and there's nothing here that suggests a demand management program is a foregone conclusion. The only way a demand management program could be stood up is if each of the upper division states independently approves one. But through those documents, we've built in a process where in the lower basin gets to participate in the study, the feasibility study with regard to a demand management program. And so they will have input as this thing goes forward. So if there's any drop dead issues for them, they have plenty of on-ramps in order to interject their concerns with regard to such a program. Bottom line, any such program would put more water into Lake Powell. The sole purpose is to assure that we're complying with our own compact obligations to them. So it's to get more water to them as per our obligation under the 22 compact. That being said, none of the agreements give the lower basin a veto over our ability to stand up a demand management program. They get to have input, but they don't get to say no. That's the short answer.
So a follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So what's the incentive there for us as an upper basin state to do that?
The incentive, Mr. Chairman, Representative Moniz, is to avoid mandatory curtailment. Senator Moise, I apologize, but to avoid mandatory curtailment. So the idea is to have a program that potentially lays lighter on our water users in the event that we get to the point where we might violate the 1922 compact. There are provisions built into the 1948 compact where we could be made to curtail some of our uses. That'd be mandatory dispassionate priority regulation. Our post-compact water users would have to be turned off until we complied with our compact obligations. This idea is an opportunity for folks to voluntarily participate in a compensated way, get paid not to use their water in advance, so that they could avoid, or our post-compact users could avoid, this mandatory curtailment. That's the motivation.
One more follow-up. So then, I'm assuming all the states would have to have a program for it to be beneficial to, say, the state of Wyoming.
The program that we're considering would be an upper basin demand management program. It has to work in all 4 upper division states in order for it to be successful. And so as we do this investigation, each state, and I'll add on to a couple of things that Pat said, but each state will have to do its own feasibility and investigation to see if such a program would work within the laws of the state of Wyoming. But at the same time, we have to investigate how that's going to work. So for example, if we have conserved consumptive use in Wyoming, how do I potentially get that water through Colorado and Utah into Lake Powell? So the whole program is going to have to work together. It's going to have to work consistently in all 4 upper division states in order for the program to work. And ultimately, once that water gets stored in one of the initial units, probably Lake Powell, it's the Upper Colorado River Commission that gets to determine when that water is released in order to comply with the 1922 compact. So this is a 4-state effort. It's got to work in all 4 states, and then it has to work consistently. And just to add on, if I might, Senator Hicks, Pat had mentioned that there will be stakeholder meetings with regard to specifically demand management as we go out and start investigating the feasibility. And there are a lot of issues roped into and wrapped around what demand management might ultimately look at. And so for everybody's information here, the first 4-state meeting has already been scheduled. It's going to be June 21st in Salt Lake City. We don't have all the details yet, but it's kind of an initial workshop to meet with upper basin stakeholders to try to collect concerns, identify the issues, and start the process. At the same time, the state engineer's office and my office are trying to put together a plan to reach out separately to just Wyoming stakeholders with regard to the issues that might be here in Wyoming. And we're looking at different opportunities and avenues where we can begin that process in Wyoming as well. As you can imagine, our primary or largest stakeholder is agricultural use, and right now isn't the best time for those folks to be participating in such a thing. So we're looking at the best way to reach out to our stakeholders and collect that information with regard to demand management. On the other side, with regard to the drought response operations agreement, we're really not doing anything at this time. The way that agreement is built, it's based on projections. It's based on forecasts. And we don't start doing anything to try to develop a plan to move water down from the upper units until a 24-month study tells us that we're at risk of potentially getting to that 35-25 buffer that Pat talked about, and we're not there yet. We don't have a forecast that suggests that we're going to be there in the next 2 years, and we don't start working on such a plan until we hit that forecast. And there's a provision built into the drought response operations agreement that once we have a draft plan put together, that all 4 upper division states and interior will then work with stakeholders to collect feedback with regard to a potential plan.
Chairman? Question, Chris, just for clarification, I think I know what you said, but the way you said it gave me a little pause for concern is that all 4 states would have a drought management plan and we'd have to agree on theirs. That's the getting the water from Wyoming, as you stated, through Colorado and Utah. But our drought management plan does not have to be approved by those other upper basin states. It can be something different, could be different type of activities. Is that correct? Or are we now, is Colorado and Utah going to be able to weigh in on what constitutes Wyoming's drought management plan and what that looks like and how we operate that in Wyoming? Or demand management, excuse me.
Chairman Senator Hicks, the way that the demand management storage agreement is arranged is, as Pat said, that almost the only thing it does, in my opinion, is to authorize that existing storage. There's another piece in that agreement that describes how it is we might access that storage between now and 2026 should we get a program stood up. And that program is an upper basin program. And there's some minimum sideboards that are built directly into that agreement that have to be met in order for a program to get stood up. Some very basic things that we even insisted upon, for example, having to be actual conserved consumptive use. We've got to be able to accurately account for what that conserved use is. We've got to be able to accurately track how that water gets from where it's conserved to where it's going to be stored. How does that all work? And those things have to be consistent, at least consistent, in all 4 upper division states in order for an upper basin demand management program to work. So it does have to be consistent enough. I'm not saying that we have to have the exact same things happening in Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, but they have to be consistent enough that, and to be honest, Wyoming is going to want to make sure that any water that Colorado might contribute to such a program is actually conserved consumptive use under the sideboards that we've identified, that they're actually saving historically consumed water if they're going to want to get credit, or if the upper basin is going to get credit in the storage account that got authorized.
Just a follow-up. The reason that I asked that question, because one of the things that's already being floated is a concept in Colorado that it would be a shared use, not based on prior appropriation, when, and quite frankly, I think you know how far that's going to fly in Wyoming. But the fact that those discussions are even going on in Colorado, that even if you've got a late water right, a municipal water right on the Front Range where you're diverting water, that you're not going to be the one that's curtailed based on prior appropriation, that the guy with the territorial water rights would have to kick in something. That's not a discussion I'm interested in entertaining in the state of Wyoming.
And Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, and I have heard those discussions going on in Colorado, and they obviously have
The big
some.
symposium next
Sure.
month, and that's going to be presented as an alternative for the state of Colorado, as you're well aware of.
Let's not talk apples and oranges.
Yeah.
Because that's primarily aimed at curtailment. They're talking about an alternative form of curtailment that's not based on priorities. So that would be in the event that we actually got to a mandatory compact curtailment. So the idea would be, if the state of Colorado, through a finding by the Upper Colorado River Commission, had to save 500,000 acre feet of water, who would get turned off to come up with that water? That's the discussion they're having there. The state engineer's office in Wyoming has always taken the position that the tool the state engineer has available to the state engineer is prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. You start regulating off post-compact rights in reverse order of priority until you come up with the amount of consumptive use necessary to satisfy our obligation. We aren't having those same conversations that they're having in Colorado. But it doesn't have to do with demand management. Remember, the demand management program concept is compensated, temporary, and voluntary. It's not going to be, who knows, it's not set up yet, but in my mind, it wouldn't be restricted to pre-compact rights or post-compact rights. It would be available to whatever existing right had historic use that could potentially participate in that program in a voluntary way if they wanted to.
Mr. Chairman, just one last question, and I think you just keyed on it, but with some of your earlier conversation talking about the bulk of the water rights being agriculture, but under the prior appropriation doctrine of we keep hearing this, that ag's going to be the big loser under potential curtailment, but I don't know that that's actually true within the Colorado River system of Wyoming, and I keep asking for how many water users are post 22 that are ag versus industrial and municipal, because my guess is there's a whole bunch of those industrial municipal users out there that are going to be affected way before the ag guys or ever even come into play under the compact and the priority system that we have. Is that, I guess, is that where part of the discussion is going to go? And we have this demand management and these discussions. Ag's the big water holder, but they're the ones that are least likely going to be damaged from a potential curtailment.
That, Senator Hicks, Mr. Chairman, good question. If we get to curtailment, you simply start with the 2019 water right and work backwards until you develop 30,000 acre feet or 70,000, however many you need. How many acre feet the Upper Colorado River Commission tells Wyoming that we owe. Senator Hicks is correct in that most of our old rights are ag rights. They're pre-22. We'll have many that are pre-1900. But the rights that would be affected if we regulated everybody off back to 1922, we're done. We don't have to go below that, even if we still haven't come up with the acre feet that we need. Most of those people are going to be later ag rights, municipal rights, industrial rights. If you think of the power plants in the basin, are going to have more junior rights. And so that's the order that would go. And how they would respond is probably to seek temporary water use agreement or some other way to gather a right that would still be in priority. And there would be an exchange of consideration over how that happens, and that we do that every year now anyway. I say we, I used to do it, and I'm sure they still are, where a junior right with a cash register needs a sure water supply, and they will go enter an agreement with a pre-22 or a water right that's still in priority and get their beneficial use and their consumptive use. But Chris is exactly right. The demand management program is an alternative path to our water users that does not necessarily follow prior appropriation. It's everybody's invited to the game. If the program is stood up in a 1942 water right with evidence of historic use, and we can scientifically find a way and legally to get that water from that point of diversion down through Fontenelle and Flaming Gorge to Lake Powell, then they might be compensated for that. That water then protects all of us in the future and any rights potentially from being curtailed because we'll have stored water in Lake Powell to make up for it. It's in lieu of a delivery. Again, there's a lot of work to be done in that program. It helps, I think, and I was going to respond to Senator Moniz a minute ago when he said, do all the states have a demand management program? Well, the one in the lower basin is their DCP, and I find it helpful to remember the hydraulics of the river. Their reservoir is above all of them. All they have to do to prop up the level in Lake Mead is not order water, and it just stays there. It evaporates some of it, but they are just not placing orders. And so their draw on that reservoir will go down under the plan. In the upper basin, our reservoir, the large one that solves our compliance problem year after year at Lee Ferry, is below everybody. And so the only way to get extra water, conserved water in it, is to not divert it at a head gate and then follow its track and its transit losses, its evaporative losses down the river system to Lake Powell. That's some of the science that needs to get done. But the hydraulics make for two very different types of plans. One, you have to track water 200 or 300 miles, and the other one, you just don't place an order. So really, their DCP is their demand management program. Ours has yet to be built.
Anything else?
Mr. Chairman, I do have one question for Pat. We talk about Fontenelle Reservoir here, and the commission is looking at enlarging that, okay? What effect does that have with what you're doing if we retain additional storage? Do we get some kind of credit or something downstream to say, yeah, we got more water if we need it? What is that?
Excellent point. Commissioner Suker, Mr. Chairman, we are working very hard to keep Fontenelle in Wyoming's hip pocket. We already have 120,000 acre feet in contract space in that reservoir. The work, I wouldn't quite term it an enlargement of Fontenelle. What we're doing is getting access to the existing bottom 80,000 acre feet that just sit there now, but can't be accessed because the dam is not armored at that elevation. So the entire water right, by the way, for Fontenelle shows that they could draw that water down. So they don't have to do anything from a water right standpoint to be able to access that 80,000. We simply needed the ability to work with reclamation to get that the bottom part of the front face of the dam rip-wrapped. Yes, the state of Wyoming, our discussions have been that we would be entertaining access to that water should we need it. We don't know precisely when, and this is more of a water development project than one of mine, but when that armoring will occur, because it is cheaper if we can do it in the dry, but when you get in the dry, you've got to essentially drain the reservoir, and you've got a whole host of other concerns and considerations at that point. The fishery, refilling, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what likely could happen is if we ever get into a situation where we've used, let's say, our first resort in making sure that we don't have a curtailment is moving some of that water currently under contract to Wyoming down to Lee Ferry. But if we get down to that bottom where all of a sudden that 80,000 is next, that's when you would then go in and rip-wrap it and make that water available. So those are the types of plans we're looking at. But I would say, in addition to, well, of course, on the curtailment side, on the curtailment side, the state engineer's office has done that for over 100 years. They know how to do that. If we're going to try to simply forestall and take water stored in Fontenelle and use that in lieu of turning people off, that's going to be our first resort. So yes, Fontenelle has great value, and we have approached the Bureau with these concepts a couple of times. So that work is continuing.
Mr. Chairman. Can I ask another question on Fontenelle?
I'm going to let you one more.
All right, thank you. Within Fontenelle, and we start looking at the whole demand management program that we stand up, and the question is wouldn't it be more advantageous for the state of Wyoming with if we stand up a demand management program to have that storage in Fontenelle? And the reason I ask that, at least what I've read so far, I think we all realize that we're not going to get 500,000 acre feet out of the upper basin in 1 year. So it's going to accrue over a number of years. And obviously you're going to have to suffer evaporative losses on whatever account that you have in Lake Powell or any of those other rooms. And the lower you put it in the system, the more you lose just because of the evaporative demand. So wouldn't it be very advantageous to Wyoming that if we do a demand management program is to store our water in Fontenelle on a block and then be able to move that down the system, and instead of trying to trickle it down to Flaming Gorge and accrue in that account plus the increased evaporative demand, be able to do that in Fontenelle? And so a question, one of the things on that is I had a conversation with the director of Bureau Reclamation, Brenda Berman, on that issue, and asked her if that would be something Interior would consider. And they said until somebody asked it, they would always entertain that. But do you guys think that would be a more advantageous place to store any demand management water project that we actually do under a DM program?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, under the principle that storing higher has less evaporation, then absolutely. I think you also have to take a look, and so it should be on the table. Absolutely. I think you have to look also at the operating characteristics of Fontenelle, Flaming Gorge, and Powell right now. Fontenelle and Flaming Gorge typically fill every year. In fact, they've drawn down Fontenelle right now for flood control. So those two, under current operation, we've got 120,000 under our name there already, tend to fill and spill, and they don't really have that empty, they don't have the bathtub ring that Powell has. Powell is the one with the space that hasn't filled in some time. The other two tend to go up and down, and as you know, Fontenelle, or in my view, Fontenelle is hydraulically small for that river. 345,000 acre feet on a river that averages about 1 million past it every year. It's going to fill every year. So where would our water be in that? That's what have to be teased apart, Senator Hicks, is where does it, how can we keep our name on some water in a reservoir that it might have to be the first water that spills. And if we did, then we'd track it to the gorge, and when it spills out of there, track it to Powell. But Powell's the one with the capacity right now. The other two don't typically have that.
If I could just add, Mr. Chairman, and just to be clear, under the current demand management storage authorization, it only reaches the initial units. And so that authorized 500,000 acre feet can only be in Lake Powell, Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, or Navajo. So under that current authorization, Fontenelle, we could not use. We seriously discussed when we were drafting the demand management storage agreement, how Fontenelle, and in fact, we held out for about as long as we could with regard to potentially including CRISP participating projects, which Fontenelle is. There are a bunch in Colorado, and some of the discussion came down to just the complexities with including more than Fontenelle, because then you're taking a look at some of the participating projects in the other states and what might their role be in the whole upper basin demand management scenario. And I'm not suggesting that Fontenelle can't play some role in Wyoming's participation in demand management, because we don't have it stood up yet. And so we're still considering all what might be taken into consideration. But under the demand management storage agreement and the federal authorization, storage is not authorized there for that specific purpose.
Or Mike. I don't know why you keep getting to be Pat today.
It just doesn't matter.
I'm rusty.
I want to make sure I heard what you said. when they're emptying the reservoirs to fill Mead and Powell, they can't use Fontenelle. But we can use Fontenelle under demand management, can't we? For part of our demand management plan?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Purcell, and I'm trying to make sure we're not mixing up what we're talking about. The drought response operations agreement, of course, we're just using the initial units as well. And then the demand management, what I was talking about was the authorized storage space. And so the whole concept would be making that space available for conserved consumptive use under a demand management program. And why it's important to be under that federally authorized program, because then it does not affect our releases to Lake Mead, which is to say, if we put more water in the initial units, it doesn't make greater releases out of Lake Powell. Fontenelle is not included in that calculus because it is not an initial unit. I'm not suggesting that we can't somehow use Fontenelle as part of Wyoming's participation in that program, but just something to think about, a requirement built into that agreement for the demand management program. You have to be able to show historic consumptive use. And we don't have that out of the water currently stored in Fontenelle. So just something to think about as we think about how would we potentially use that water in a demand management program if it hasn't been historically consumptively used, whether or not it would qualify for the demand management program.
That's true. Give Hicks extra.
But in the harsh reality of life, we could use that water to replace the consumptive use that we have retired.
And Mr. Chairman, the way that we've been looking at Fontenelle is to help Wyoming water users. So in the event of a curtailment, so not talking about demand management now, in the event that we get into a mandatory curtailment event, we can use that water as replacement water. We don't have to turn off our Wyoming water users because we have water that was stored in priority that we can deliver out of priority to make up for that water use. So for example, if I've got a post-compact user in the Little Snake Basin even, who we would potentially have to turn off for a compact curtailment, we could enter into an exchange, allow that diverter to keep using its water, run the water out of Fontenelle to make up for that consumptive use. That's primarily how we've been looking at it. Also in discussions currently with Bureau of Reclamation of just saying we're going to the state of Wyoming, call the Bureau of Reclamation, say release 20,000 acre feet, and that's our consumptive use contribution to the curtailment. So we're having those discussions as well.
And I think that's a realistic scenario when you look at the largest water right holder in the Little Snake Basin is the city of Cheyenne with a 1979 water right.
Mr. Chairman, Mike, it is complicated to the fact that Fontenelle itself, I believe those permits are post 22. So we also have to consider in those days to make sure our carryover storage is as high as it can possibly be, because once it's stored for a year, it's ours. But or I don't know, I'll leave it to the finer minds how we could best utilize Fontenelle. But there is that one slight curveball in our use of Fontenelle.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Purcell, that's something to keep in mind. And I've looked at Fontenelle as assumed demand management never gets stood up. Fontenelle still has value to us for that blunting of a curtailment, as Chris just mentioned. But Fontenelle is post 22. If we get into a curtailment event, which says post 22 rights are, and it goes back to Fontenelle's priority date, it can't refill. So it gets whatever it had stored in priority as our buffer to be released as Wyoming's contribution to meet the compact amount at Lee Ferry until its storage is gone. And at that point, then we might end up, that's the dark side. Then you're looking at curtailing rights, I think.
Mr. Chairman, we of course have to be concerned about our customers in Fontenelle. And to a certain extent, as you well know, they operate Fontenelle as a power plant. And so there, in your discussions with the Bureau, I would hope that maybe we could talk to them about, in fact, increasing, at least looking in their operation of the reservoir in dry conditions, to maybe give up a little power for the benefit of the storing water. And then we tried that years ago when I had a different hat on, but in order to get their attention, the wolf had to be at the door. And maybe now the wolf's at the door.
And Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Purcell, we've been having those discussions and in describing the carryover and how the effect of drier conditions would make them more conservative in their operations. And just to kind of add to that point, that's kind of where the value of the bottom 80,000 acre feet comes in, because even if they do continue to draw down as they have historically, we're always going to have that bottom 80,000 at the acre feet that they don't have to draw down for either flood releases or power generation.
Mr. Chairman, I was going to say the same thing Chris was. We've had those discussions with them, and we continue to have those discussions. And the only thing I would add would be what Chris mentioned earlier was about, I think through the drought contingency planning, how the initial units would be drawn down first to prevent curtailment. So it'd be kind of a slow moving train coming at us, so we can change those operations when we see it coming. But those are part of the discussions we've been having with the Bureau and how we set that up for that particular situation in the future.
And thank you, guys.
Well, thank you for your
Mr. Chairman.
participation. We learned a little something today. Anybody got something else to say?
Just one quick.
One more?
Yeah, one more, just for information, but, and I don't know, I know Pacific Corp with Jim Bridger as a contractor in Fontenelle. I don't know how many acre feet that they've actually got contracted, or whether they got direct. I think they've got contract water out of there. But under the historic use of the consumptive use, knowing that we know with what Pacific Corp's IRP is in the next 6 years to basically mothball Jim Bridger, how long does that historic use of that water then? Because my recollection is there's somewhere between 30 and 40,000 acre feet contracted out of Fontenelle. So how long can we claim that historic use as to be available that we could then, because that is a consumptive use that's currently on the system that might likely disappear in the next 6 years?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, we break that into a couple of different pieces. One of the reasons why the demand management storage agreement doesn't specifically dictate a time period with regard to historic consumptive use is because each of the upper division states is a little bit different. And so that's one of the things that we have to sit down and analyze and come to some sort of an agreement. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 3 years? Is it something else? The Wyoming Board of Control takes a look at it in changes of use and changes of place of use. It's a little bit different than the way that they take a look at it in Colorado. So I can't answer you how long might that be available. I'd also say that the direct flow diversion and use of water that the power plants are making definitely would be historic consumptive use. I don't know that I could say the same thing about the water that's been stored there and ready to serve that's never been called for. And it's my understanding as of right now, I think we have 4 contracts out of Fontenelle at around 46,000 acre feet and currently negotiating another one.
Okay, is that everything? That's everything I have on this little sheet. Well, thank you, gentlemen. If not, we'll take a 15-minute break. And then we'll...
Chairman, that's what we've got on the agenda for today. So unless you're going to allow us to move into tomorrow, I don't know what else we have to talk about.
Anyway, we're going to take a 15-minute, and we're going to decide who we're going to put in as chairman and all that stuff. But we're going to take a break first.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'd smack the gavel and close this session, and then we're just going to have a little get together.
The meeting's over. Thank you, everybody.